Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for the opportunity given to me. Today, I would like to present a topic entitled Human Reproductive System. In this presentation, I will explain the structure and function of reproductive organ, reproductive hormones, gametogenesis, fertilization, pregnancy, the menstrual cycle, and several disorders of the reproductive system. Let's begin our discussion. Before we start, let's look at the learning objective. After this lesson, students are expected to be able to describe the structure and function of male and female reproductive organs, explain the process of fertilization and pregnancy, and understand the importance of maintaining reproductive health. So, what is the reproductive system? The reproductive system is a group of organs that work together to produce offspring and ensure the continuation of human life. It consists of male and female reproductive organs that have different structure and function but work together in the process reproduction. The reproductive system has several important functions. First, it produces reproductive cells, namely sperm cell and egg cell. Second, it produces hormones that regulate reproductive activities. Third, it provides a place where fertilization can occur. And finally, it enables the production and development of offspring. Now, let's discuss the male reproductive organ. The testes are responsible for producing sperm cell and the hormone testosterone. The penis function for both the elimination of urine from the body and delivery of sperm for sexual reproduction. The urethra is passageway for both urine and semen when exciting the body. The vas deferens is transport sperm from the testes toward the urethra. The urethra is passageway for both urine and semen when exciting the body. Finally, the prostate produces a fluid that mixes with sperm to form semen, nourishing and protecting sperm. Next, hormones in males. There are three important hormones in the male reproductive system. The first is testosterone, which is responsible for the development of secondary sexual characteristics and assists in sperm production. The second is follicle-stimulating hormone, which stimulates sperm formation. The third is luteinizing hormone, which stimulates the production of testosterone. Next, let's move on the female reproductive organ. The ovaries produce egg cell and female sex hormone like estrogen and progesterone. The oviduct, also known as the fallopian tube, is the place where fertilization usually occurs. The uterus is the organ where fertilized egg implants and grow into a fetus during pregnancy. The cervix allows menstrual blood to flow from the uterus and serve as a pathway from sperm to enter the uterus. And the vagina resects the penis during sexual reproduction, allows the menstrual blood to exit the body, and lets the baby pass through during childbirth. Next, hormone in females. The female reproductive system is controlled by several hormones. First is estrogen, regulate the menstrual cycle and secondary sexual characteristics. Second is progesterone, prepares and maintains the uterine lining for pregnancy. Third is follicle-stimulating hormone. It stimulates the maturation of egg cell. Meanwhile, luteinizing hormone triggers ovulation, which is the release of a mature egg from the ovary. Next is gametogenesis. First is spermatogenesis. Spermatogenesis is the process of sperm formation in the testes. Next is gametogenesis. First, spermatogenesis. Spermatogenesis is the process of sperm cell formation that occurs in the testes. The process begins with spermatogonia, which develop into spermatocytes, spermatids, and finally spermatozoa. Next, oogenesis. Similar to spermatogenesis, females undergo a process called oogenesis. Oogenesis is the process of ovum or egg cell formation that occurs in the ovaries. The process begins with oogonia and develops into primary oocytes, secondary oocytes, and finally mature ova. The journey of a sperm cell. Now let's look at the journey of a sperm cell. Sperm are produced in the testes and mature in epididymis. They then travel through the vas deferens and urethra before leaving the male body during ejaculation. Inside the female reproductive tract, sperm travel through the vagina, cervix, and uterus to reach the ovidum. If a sperm successful meets an egg cell, fertilization occurs. Next, pregnancy. Pregnancy begins after the zygote attached to the wall of the uterus. The zygote develops into an embryo and later into a fetus. These stages are the zygote, morula, blastula, gastrula, embryo, and finally the fetus. The fetus continues to grow and develop until birth.
You were once the size of the head of a pin. Let's just start out with that. 2 millimeters at the most. And today, I don't know you, but I'm assuming that you're a lot larger than that. Many, many pinheads from head to toe. Assuming the average human is about 1.7 meters, it's safe to say that you're about 850 times taller than when you started out as a zygote. I think we all deserve a round of applause. I'm very proud of us. But how did it happen? How does a single cell eventually grow into the fully formed several trillion-celled body we've spent all year discussing? And for that matter, how the heck does a female body nurture, protect, and generally tolerate growing a whole new person inside of it with all the mood swings and sore and swollen parts, increased blood volume, constant pee breaks, and general body weirdness? On an emotional level, I have no idea how the mothers, or the zygotes for that matter, endure all of that. But on a physiological level, like so many aspects of our body's functions, pregnancy begins and ends with the same thing: hormones. Last week we left off with a sperm and an egg against all odds finally getting together to make a zygote. Now, how that tiny head of a pin gets to be even a fraction of the size you are now, a newborn human that's say 50 centimeters long, is complex. It involves a system of hormonal signals that, as sophisticated as they are, get interpreted by the very earliest human cells into 3 simple instructions: divide, differentiate, develop. The first step, dividing, begins in what's known as the cleavage phase, when cells cleave, or split in two, over and over. It starts about 24 hours after fertilization, when a little zygote turns from 1 cell into 16 cells called blastomeres. The cells divide so quickly that they don't actually grow between divisions, they just create more smaller cells. This allows each little cell to have more surface area, which helps them take in the oxygen and nutrients they need from their environment. And of course, it also creates more raw materials for building an even larger zygote and eventually an embryonic human. Like, you don't make a car by carving it from a single chunk of metal. You put together lots of smaller components, each with its own form form and function. That's what these cells are during cleavage. About 3 days after fertilization, these divisions have formed a little berry-shaped cluster of cells that looks different and complex enough to get a whole new name, a morula, from the Latin for mulberry. It's one of the cuter terms you'll come across in human physiology, and it also marks the end of the cleavage stage. Because the little cells that make up the morula don't stay together as a solid mass. Instead, they start to form a hollow sphere filled with fluid, a blastocyst. A blastocyst contains a single outer layer of large, flat trophoblast cells, and inside, a cluster of smaller cells forms called the inner cell mass. This mass is what's going to turn into the embryo eventually, while the trophoblasts will go on to form the placenta and blood vessels that will nourish it. But keep in mind that during all these early divisions, the zygote and then the morula are on the move. They're headed down the fallopian tube toward the uterus. So in addition to manufacturing a ton of tiny pieces and assembling them into something that's getting increasingly complex, the whole operation is mobile. It's kind of like you're building a car while you're driving it. When the blastocyst reaches the uterus, it just floats around for a few days, soaking up secretions that are full of vitamins and glycoproteins, looking for a place to call home. But soon it's going to need permanent nutritional support. So about a week after ovulation, it snuggles up to the endometrial layer and starts the process of implantation. Now up to this point, we've just been talking about the zygote itself and the changes it's been undergoing, and we're all very proud of it. But from here on, the changes are best understood not just in terms of the budding, soon-to-be embryo, but in terms of the whole environment where its changes are taking place. That environment being the mother's body. Implantation is only possible, after all, thanks to surges of estrogen and progesterone from the corpus luteum, the ruptured follicle that we talked about last time. And together they prepare the endometrium to receive the blastocyst, allowing the uterine lining to bind to little proteins on the trophoblasts, holding onto them for the duration of the pregnancy. If all goes according to plan, implantation takes about 5 days and finishes up around 12 days after ovulation, right around when menstruation would otherwise kick in and slough off the endometrium. If that happened, it would be bad, so trophoblasts secrete a luteinizing-like hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. This hormone bypasses the whole hypothalamic-pituitary-ovarian axis, if you remember that, and talks directly to the corpus luteum, telling it to keep pumping out estrogen and progesterone. So the first thing to notice here is that from this point on, most of what's happening in this little clump of cells is happening because hormones. HCG is basically calling all the shots, triggering the release of other hormones that are crucial to the blastocyst's development. But while hormones are doing the grunt work, you might also notice that the blastocyst is really in charge now. Essentially, it has taken over hormonal control of the whole uterus. The release of hormones is that powerful. In fact, a whole new, albeit temporary, organ is forming at this point too, which is going to take over the hormone-controlling job. That's the placenta. The placenta is one of the defining and most amazing structures in the mammalian class. It's an organ that only appears during pregnancy and is created by the melding of both maternal and embryonic tissues. Together with the umbilical cord, it provides for the direct transfer of nutrients, hormones, and wastes between mother and offspring. These elements start to really take shape after implantation is complete, and we enter the embryonic stage. This is where the blastocyst differentiates into various cell types and develops into a legit embryo surrounded by an amniotic sac and hooked up to the placenta. And around the end of week 8, this tiny thing is now officially a fetus. Over the next several months, it rapidly develops organ systems and bones and grows into what you see in the delivery room. But rather than focus on those changes, I want to look more at what profound and frankly sometimes bizarre adaptations the mother is going through. The most obvious changes are, of course, the anatomical changes. Basically, everything's getting huge. The mother's breasts swelled and engorged with blood, and her baby bump gains dimension as the normally fist-sized uterus expands, pushing organs out of the way until it pretty much takes up the entire abdominal cavity from the diaphragm to the bladder. The growing placenta is still secreting estrogen and progesterone, but it's also pumping out relaxin, a hormone that loosens joints and ligaments to increase flexibility, and it also releases human placental lactogen, or HPL. This hormone cocktail does helpful stuff like tell the fetus to grow and get the breasts ready to lactate, and it also causes the mother's body to start hoarding glucose for the fetus to use. This increase in metabolism, combined with the fact that the kidneys also have to process waste from the fetus, leads to greater urine production, which every expectant mother is familiar with. It also has a huge effect on the cardiovascular system, because a pregnant woman's blood volume can increase by as much as 40%. 40%! Imagine walking around with an extra 2-liter bottle's worth of blood in your body and how much harder your heart would have to work to move it all around. This increased blood flow and pressure can actually make your gums swell and bleed, and fluid retention can literally change the shape of your corneas, potentially blurring your vision. Not only that, but the expanded uterus compresses pelvic blood vessels, affecting veins' ability to bring blood up from the lower limbs, resulting in swelling varicose veins, and if all that weren't bad enough, hemorrhoids. Fortunately, every pregnancy eventually comes to an end, usually about 38 to 40 weeks after fertilization, if all goes as planned. But unfortunately, the process of getting the baby out is pretty much a painful mess. Ask any mother. Giving birth is not for the faint of heart. The process of preparing the body for labor and then actually initiating it begins again with a change in hormones. Up until the last few weeks before birth, the placenta has been kicking out equally high amounts of both progesterone and estrogen. One of progesterone's main jobs has been to keep the smooth muscles in the uterus relaxed so they can't contract and stimulate labor too early. But as the due date nears, the mother undergoes a sudden decline in progesterone. Now estrogen takes over. This is partially because the fetus itself is ready to go, and it starts releasing hormones like cortisol that tell the placenta to release even more estrogen to get the uterus ready for birth. Just like HCG calls the shots around the time of implantation, here estrogen is barking out all kinds of orders. For one thing, it prepares the uterus to start receiving new chemical signals by triggering its myometrial cells to start making receptors for the hormone oxytocin. It also triggers the formation of gap junctions between smooth muscle cells in the uterus. This will let individual muscle cells contract simultaneously when the time comes. Then, as labor nears, special cells in the fetus itself start secreting oxytocin, which binds to all the newly minted receptors and tells the placenta to release prostaglandins. Together, both of these hormones, oxytocin and prostaglandins, stimulate the uterine muscles to start contracting. When the contractions get strong enough to distend the cervix, it stimulates the release of even more oxytocin and prostaglandins, which keep the contractions rolling in one big positive feedback loop, initiating labor. The earliest stage of labor, dilation, is the period from when the first contractions begin to when the cervix becomes fully dilated to about 10 centimeters. During this time, each new contraction pushes the infant's head against the cervix, causing the cervix to thin and dilate. Once the cervix is fully dilated, the mother should feel the urge to push. The resulting expulsion stage lasts from full dilation through crowning and actual delivery as the infant is pushed headfirst through the cervix and out the vagina. But even after the baby is out, the mother still has a placenta to get out. Within about 30 minutes of delivery, strong contractions carry out the placental stage of labor, dislodging the placenta from the uterine wall to deliver the so-called afterbirth. Then finally, the mother can rest and marvel at how her body just built another tiny body inside it, complete with all the complex systems we've spent the last year talking about. And maybe someday that little baby will grow up and get a twinkle in its eye and combine alleles with somebody else and start the whole process all over again. And that is how the human race continues to exist. Today, you learned about the stages of pregnancy, beginning with how a zygote develops into blastomeres, to a morula and a blastocyst, and finally to an embryo and a fetus. You also learned about the amazing anatomical changes that take place in the mother and the hormonal sequence of events that lead to labor. After that, all you have to worry about is how you're gonna put the little thing through college. Thank you to our headmaster of learning, Linnea Boyev, and thanks to all of our Patreon patrons whose monthly contributions help make Crash Course possible, not only for themselves, but for everyone everywhere. If you like Crash Course and want to help us keep making videos like this one, you can go to patreon.com/crashcourse. This episode was filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney Crash Course studio. It was written by Kathleen Yale. The script was edited by Blake DiPestino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. It was directed by Nicholas Jenkins, edited by Nicole Sweeney. Our sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Stage of the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle consists of 4 phases. The first is the follicular phase, when the pituitary gland releases hormones that stimulate the growth and development of ovarian follicles. The second is ovulation phase, when a mature egg is released from the ovary and is ready for potential fertilization. The third is luteal phase. Empty ovarian follicle becomes the corpus luteum, producing hormones that prepare the uterus for possible embryo implantation. Menstruation. Lining of the uterus is set, resulting in the release of blood and tissue from the body through the vagina. If fertilization does not occur, the uterine lining is set, resulting in menstruation.
From time to time, we post a few topics we'd like to cover and take a poll from our audience on our community tab. And you know what? The control of the menstrual cycle won by a landslide. We know it shows up on some tests, but we don't think that's the only reason it won. It's also fascinating, a process that, like many biology topics, has so much complexity behind it with different hormones regulating it and involves a variety of structures. Our goal is that by the end of this video, you'll agree. Before we start, let's intro some terms. The menstrual cycle is a cycle of changes that involve reproductive hormones and female reproductive structures. It has an average length of 28 days, but that can vary. Ultimately, the changes that occur in this cycle prepare the female reproductive system for potential pregnancy. We want you to know we've observed some sources isolate menstrual cycle to the events that happen in the uterine cycle, that is, specific changes involving the uterus, while other sources will use the term menstrual cycle as more of an encompassing term that includes the uterine cycle and also the ovarian cycle, which is focused on changes in the ovaries. Ultimately, it's important to understand that there are changes happening that impact the ovary, which you can refer to as the ovarian cycle, and there are changes that involve the uterus, which you can refer to as the uterine cycle. And those changes correlate and impact each other, and they're both happening together, concurrently, and it is the two of them that are the focus of this video. First, let's intro some major structures involved. In our endocrine system video, when we mentioned the female reproductive system, we showed the ovaries. Not technically connected to the ovaries, but very close, are fallopian tubes, and they lead to the uterus. A little function review: an ovary releases an egg. There are 2 ovaries, but generally only one of the ovaries will release 1 egg each month. The egg travels through the fallopian tube. If sperm is present, the egg can get fertilized in the fallopian tube, and the egg already starts some cell divisions on its way to implant in the lining of the uterus, where it can continue to develop. If the egg is not fertilized in the fallopian tube, it starts breaking down and cannot get implanted in the uterus. So that was some basic structure. Let's now circle through this diagram of the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle phases. You'll see the uterine cycle is the outer ring, and then the ovarian cycle is the inner ring. All of this is using an average 28-day cycle. This diagram emphasizes that both cycles are happening concurrently. We're going to refer to this circle diagram when explaining events happening in both the uterine cycle and ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle includes 2 main phases: follicular phase and luteal phase. The uterine cycle includes 3 main phases: menstrual flow, proliferative phase, and secretory phase. So let's walk through each of these phases now. So let's start with the first phase of the uterine cycle, the menstrual flow phase. On day 1 of our circle diagram, the uterine lining is shedding. This uterine lining will shed for a few days, and while the average is 5 days, this can vary. This is referred to as menses, or having a period. That's why it's in the menstrual flow phase. At the same time, because remember these cycles happen concurrently, the ovarian cycle, which you can see on our circle diagram, is in the first of its 2 phases, the follicular phase. During this phase, follicles are starting to grow in the ovaries. Each follicle contains an egg cell, so the follicle is like a little egg house that will continue to grow throughout the phase. Let's return to the uterus as we look at the next uterine cycle phase, the proliferative phase. Around day 5 or 6 or 7, remember the days are approximate, the uterine lining, or endometrium if you want to use a fancier term, starts to regrow. This is a big deal because eventually it will need to be rich with blood vessels so that it could have the ability to nourish a blastocyst someday. A blastocyst is a fertilized egg that has done several divisions. Meanwhile, around this time in the ovarian cycle, we're still in the follicular phase, but around day 5, the follicles have been growing more, and as they do, they will eventually start to approach the surface of the ovaries. Around day 14, a major event happens in the ovarian cycle: ovulation. Generally, the most mature and dominant follicle, which is bulging at the surface of one of the ovaries, will break open, rupture, and out comes an egg. The egg will leave the ovary and travel the fallopian tube where it can be fertilized by a sperm cell. The other follicles had all degenerated at some point in this follicular phase. The egg each of them had is lost forever. Keep in mind, though, there are a lot more eggs available for the next cycle. When ovulation is over, the ovarian cycle will enter the luteal phase. And that ruptured follicle that we mentioned, well, guess what? It's actually still around. It's now a structure called the corpus luteum. Still in the ovary, its work is not done. Soon it will be secreting hormones that help that lining of the uterus build up and prepare for possible implantation. Let's look at the uterine cycle now. It also will enter a new phase after ovulation. It's the secretory phase. All this endometrial tissue, this uterine lining, is continuing to build up and prepare for potential implantation of a blastocyst. If no blastocysts implants in the uterus, ultimately the corpus luteum will break down and the endometrium will start to degenerate. Day 1 of a new cycle will be when bleeding occurs again. Okay, so that was a broad overview. But what about the control of all of this? The regulation. We're going to first introduce the hormones and glands that regulate those cycles, and then walk through the cycles again and explain how those hormones regulate each phase. So to introduce the glands and hormones, you've got the gland called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases GnRH, or gonadotropin-releasing hormone. The main function of GnRH? GnRH stimulates another gland known as the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is a gland that releases FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. For females, FSH has a major role in stimulating follicles, so it helps them grow. The other hormone, LH, also helps with this, but it's also critical in starting ovulation, which releases the egg, and it also helps the ovaries with their work of making hormones. Finally, the ovaries themselves are glands that secrete hormones. Progesterone and estradiol, which is a form of estrogen, are 2 ovarian hormones that will have major roles in the menstrual cycle, which we'll get to very soon. So remember the major events we mentioned that were happening in an average 28-day cycle? Now we'll talk about the regulation of them, and we'll use the circle chart all over again. Back to day 1, uterine cycle, we're in the menstrual flow phase. After the corpus luteum broke down, estradiol and progesterone levels dropped, and this hormone drop can lead to blood vessels in the uterine lining to constrict, which cuts off circulation to the uterine lining and contributes to the breakdown of the uterine lining. This results in bleeding, or menses. Now meanwhile, let's consider the ovarian cycle. Follicular phase. Early on in the follicular phase, the hypothalamus will be secreting GnRH, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, though in low amounts. Small follicles have FSH receptors. FSH will stimulate the growth of the follicles. As these follicles grow, they begin to release estradiol. Low levels of estradiol will result in negative feedback on the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, which inhibits the secretion of GnRH and keeps levels of LH and FSH relatively low. Let's move to the next uterine cycle phase, the proliferative phase. Remember, in this phase, the lining, the endometrium, is stimulated to regrow, thanks largely to that increasing estradiol. Back to the ovarian cycle, still in the follicular phase, though later in the follicular phase, the low FSH levels prevented most follicles from reaching this point. But there will be a mature follicle that is dominant in making more and more estradiol. Now it gets tricky here, so hang with me. While you remember low levels of estradiol inhibiting the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, ultimately leading to low secretion of GnRH, FSH, and LH, high levels of estradiol actually stimulate these glands, resulting in more GnRH secretion through positive feedback. So when that estradiol reaches a certain high level, GnRH secretion will go up, and as expected with that, the anterior pituitary will start cranking out more FSH and LH. LH starts to really increase. This rapid increase is known as an LH surge. The LH surge will trigger ovulation to happen roughly a day or so later. Recall that ovulation is when there is a bursting of that mature dominant follicle, releasing the egg. The ovarian cycle moves to the luteal phase after ovulation. LH is involved in stimulating that follicle that had burst to become the corpus luteum. Now, we had mentioned the corpus luteum has a job helping the uterine lining build up as it prepares for potential implantation. And it does as the corpus luteum produces estradiol and progesterone, which are important for the next uterine cycle phase. That next phase of the uterine cycle is the secretory phase, where both estradiol and progesterone, especially progesterone, are responsible for helping to build up and maintain the uterine lining. In addition, that estradiol and progesterone, the combination of the two, will inhibit the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary through negative feedback, which ultimately means less GnRH, FSH, and LH will be secreted. That's important because there could, after all, be a potential pregnancy, and so more follicles do not need to be developed right now. Now, if there is no implantation of a blastocyst in the uterus, let's look at the end of the ovarian cycle in the luteal phase. The corpus luteum breaks down. If it breaks down, it's not going to be making all the estradiol and progesterone. Those hormone levels drop significantly, which will stop the building of the uterine lining, that endometrium. What does that lead to? Surprise! It's back to day 1 in the menstrual flow phase of the uterine cycle, and the endometrium begins to shed. With the drop of both estradiol and progesterone, that negative feedback is gradually lifted. So now the hypothalamus can resume GnRH secretion as the cycle starts anew. Just a little helpful note, if you do a rewatch of this hormonal control part of the video, you can catch negative and positive feedback examples. We had a negative feedback example in the early to mid follicular phase and in the luteal phase after ovulation. We mentioned positive feedback happening in the late follicular phase. If you want more examples of negative or positive feedback mechanisms in this process, because there are more details to explore, like how the dominant follicle is selected, check out our further reading in our description. And one more helpful note is to see the big picture, a general chart showing general hormone levels throughout this example 28-day period. Here are the general levels of the pituitary hormones, FSH and LH, and here are the general levels of ovarian hormones we mentioned, estradiol and progesterone. If just focusing on major events here, we can see the low levels of these hormones at day 1, and you can see estradiol rise. It's being made by the follicles. When the estradiol reaches a certain level, it results in FSH and LH rising. When estradiol peaks, it leads to an LH surge. That LH surge triggers ovulation roughly a day or so later. Then, after ovulation, that ruptured follicle becomes the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum will soon start to secrete estradiol and progesterone. If no implantation of a blastocyst in the uterus happens, that corpus luteum will ultimately break down. The hormone levels plummet, we could start again. So now one question you might have, what if a blastocyst did implant? Would all this still start over? No, because if pregnancy occurred, that uterine lining would need to be maintained and not shed. It's important for the developing embryo, and the body also would not release more eggs at the same time when there's already a pregnancy. Instead, the blastocyst will start releasing HCG. HCG is a major hormone that many pregnancy tests will use to detect a pregnancy. HCG will be involved in stimulating the corpus luteum to remain active. And that is important because the progesterone that the corpus luteum secretes is especially critical for maintaining that uterine lining. Eventually, the placenta will take over with secreting hormones and the corpus luteum will no longer be needed. Exciting, and definitely a topic for another video. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to
Disorders of the reproductive system. There are several disorders that can affect the reproductive system. Examples include infertility, cervical cancer, prostate cancer, endometriosis, and sexually transmitted diseases. Maintaining good reproductive health can help reduce the risk of these disorders. Conclusion. They conclude the reproductive system plays a vital role in human reproduction. Male and female reproductive organs have different structure and function, but they work together in the reproductive process. Hormones regulate these activities, and maintaining reproductive health is very important for overall well-being. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I hope this presentation has helped you understand the human reproductive system better. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.